I am a huge Ruchika Tulshyan fangirl, plain and simple. And you'll learn more why by listening to this replay of our conversation from last year. And even since then, Ruchika has operationalized a new way to highlight the voices of historically underrecognized folks with her Amplify July campaign. As Ruchika shared, if you have a platform and influence, you have a responsibility to use your privilege in a tangible, actionable way to amplify the voices of others. And it absolutely could look like using your social media platforms to shout out people and stories and products that should be elevated. So if you are building your influence and thought leadership, how could you take a page out of Ruchika's book and turn over the mic? We touch upon this in our conversation from last year, as well as recognizing systems of oppression as the cause of imposter syndrome, reframing mindset barriers around leadership and visibility, and how to make inclusion a daily practice in your life. And I was so grateful to get a shout out from Ruchika as part of our Amplify July campaign, who shared about this very podcast. So if you're a new listener who found out about the Campfire Circle from her campaign, please let me know. I would love to know more about you and your work. All right, here's the episode. Hey, I'm Tanya Bhattacharya, and you are listening to the Campfire Circle podcast. We are all about breaking down the boardroom table as the ultimate space of leadership, and instead replacing it with a campfire. Because that's where we share our stories. That's where we build warm community, and that is where there's always room. I'm building an impactful business in public through thought leadership, and I'm taking you behind the scenes all along the way. So if you want to stand out as you stand up for your mission, you are in the right place. Ruchika Tulshyan is the author of Inclusion on Purpose, an intersectional approach to creating a culture of belonging at work. She's also the founder of Candor, a global inclusion strategy firm, and a regular contributor to Harvard Business Review and the New York Times. Ruchika wrote a paradigm-shifting article, Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome, for Harvard Business Review with her co-author, Jodi Ann Burey. The article has over 1 million views, has been translated into multiple languages, and is one of HBR's top most 100 read articles in history. And best of all, she says, people all over the world, and by the way, I am definitely one of those people, have shared that it has completely changed their relationship with the concept of imposter syndrome. Ruchika, I'm so grateful you're here. Welcome to the Campfire Circle.
Thank you so much for having me, Tanya. I feel so thrilled that I'm here. And I think it feels a little bit like a homecoming because I do remember when the imposter syndrome article came out, you reached out to me. It was my first time ever on Clubhouse, actually, where I'd really spent time and spoke on Clubhouse. And you invited me so kindly to the gathering that you do there, Jodi Ann and I. And it just feels really nice to be reconnected right now. At that time, the book hadn't come out, so it feels great.
That's right. That's right. That's one of the beautiful things about being able to be in these really enriching relationships is getting to cheer each other on as we grow and come out with books and come out with new programs and just being able to really, really see each other grow. I love it. I love it. And so, Ruchika, there is no doubt that you are a go-to trusted expert in the area of belonging and inclusion at work, and one who has inspired so many in these spaces. And so, can you tell me a little bit about your story of what you have grown through to become the guide that you are today?
And while I will accept and I will own that, yes, I am a guide, maybe, and an expert, even though it's taking a long time for me to do that, I really want to say that I build in connection and solidarity with other people who have been doing this work for a long time and on the foundation of many, many experts and leaders. I think what I'll start off by saying is my real connection to this work began. Both the seeds were planted a long time ago. So I grew up as a person of color and a minority in Singapore. So every single country I've ever lived in, any place that I've ever called home, I was always the outsider and the other. And that gives you a very unique perspective, one that I'm both grateful for and have obviously had a very hard time navigating to. And so I'd say the seeds of were planted early of being someone whom could look into a space and say, who's missing? And why is my voice not represented here? Why don't I have role models who look like me? Why don't others who are from other minority communities, why don't they have role models who look like them? Or why are they experiencing discrimination or bias? Or I didn't have words for it back then, but already from a young age, I could see very clearly that there was a racial hierarchy. There was a gender hierarchy, the patriarchy, and then certainly reinforced very much more as I grew older. From a work perspective, it started, I was very interested as a business journalist, which is how I began my career and where my training is in, to tell the stories of especially women business owners and women leaders and people of color leaders. And I remember facing a lot of pushback from my editors being like, are people really going to be interested in this story? And our audience doesn't care about this. Our readers don't really want to know what's happening in terms of women in the workplace. And feeling really saddened by that. And then going through a variety of other experiences, both in the technology industry, now as an entrepreneur, which just reaffirmed to me that we really need to rewrite and reframe the narrative. A, that our stories don't matter, because obviously they do. But also, secondly, that it's not that there's a lack of talent or a lack of ambition or a lack of hard work. None of those things are lacking in communities that have been underrepresented. The biggest barrier that most of us face is certainly bias, racism, and sexism, but it's also truly being overlooked and underestimated in every sort of interaction in society and in the workplace. So that's really a little bit about my journey.
That's beautiful. And one thing that I've noticed recently, Ruchika, as obviously I follow you on social media, is I have seen that you have been amplifying and really using your platform to highlight the women that you've interviewed in the book. You're right. Stories are such a powerful tool for change. In my opinion, probably the most powerful tool that we have for change, because it provides insight into that lived experience, being able to identify that issue as somebody from the outside who hasn't necessarily had that same experience, and then take steps to correct it. I love that so much. I love that so much. Can you tell me a little bit too, to add to your story, about when we met? You had this viral article. You had this amazing platform. Has it always felt like that? Or can you tell me a little bit about your story of being able to get published and how you gained the confidence and the wherewithal to be able to be where you are now?
Mm. So I will say very clearly that without Jodi Ann Bury and without us co-creating this article and this thought leadership, really, there is no way that I would be where I am. And I state this very, very clearly. I've said this before, and I'm very, this is truly one of the things, one of the mantras that I believe in life, that it's an African proverb, which is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I really felt that when with this article. And so with Jodi Ann, when we got together and I told her, hey, there's this article I write for HBR regularly. I'm working on this article about overturning the myth of imposter syndrome. What do you think? And she came to the table prepared. She had clearly been thinking about this for a long time too. And us being able to work together and really share knowledge, share our points of view. And it's just truly creating something magical because we created together. Because I've been writing for a long time. I had been a journalist, as I told you. I had certainly been writing articles here and there for the internet for a long time. But to have something go this viral, for people to say that it changed their relationship with themselves, with the concept of imposter syndrome, their relationship with their workplace, the ability to have candid conversations about confidence versus facing bias in the workplace and from people around the world. It really, I knew that we had hit upon something monumental, and truly that's because we did it together.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I really do believe that sometimes 1 + 1 = 3. And being able to really combine our brain trust creates something just so magical that has never existed before. And that's the whole concept behind this campfire circle, right? It's not about the competition and the scarcity that's present in sometimes in the boardroom table, but really about the beauty that happens when you're in community and those magical things that emerge when two brains come together and create something better than the sum is greater than its parts. So
Absolutely. And Tanya, I remember when I was writing my first book, The Diversity Advantage, about women in the workplace, I kept getting asked, oh, but do you have a chapter on how women don't support other women? Even really powerful women at that point that I was writing, that I was interviewing for the book. And it was really surprising to me. I thought to myself, like, what do you mean? And then I started realizing that indeed so many of us had and have been socialized to consider each other our competition and think about this as a zero-sum game. And what I started realizing that it isn't that women inherently don't support each other or women of color don't inherently support each other. It is when you are operating in systems where you are shown there's only room for one, you're going to get out those sharp elbows. You're going to say there's only one spot, so I'm in competition with you to get to that other spot. So one of the things I feel passionately about as an entrepreneur and someone who largely operates outside of traditional corporate structures is the ability to say, no, I'm creating a different workplace and I'm creating a different paradigm where I'm not in competition with you, right? We work together. I rise, you rise, and that means I'm rising too.
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And there's so many things you said that are so great that I want to touch on. One of which being realizing that the systems that we live in have conditioned us to be in that competitive space. It's not an innate thing. It's very much not an accident that we do this. But when we are able to maintain that practice of inclusion, we can begin to lift the veil and see, oh, wait, actually, this isn't it. And we can create a new way forward. So I think that's a good segue into speaking to a little bit about your book, which, as you can see, the listeners can't see. I'm in the closet working from home issues, but normally I have a copy of your book next to my desk and it's so
Thank you.
dog-eared. Well, and I should actually take a picture of this and show it to you. It's actually funny. I've dog-eared so many pages that it doesn't actually work. Like every page is dog-eared, so it doesn't. So now I've started dog-earing the bottoms of the pages that are like
Oh my
extra good.
gosh. You're making me blush. This is such a big deal. Thank you so much. This really is very surreal, I will say.
Mm.
And it means
Mm.
so much. It means so much more. People are like, oh, but your book isn't a New York Times bestseller or it didn't sell these many copies or whatever it is. And I'll say my number one thing is I hear from people that it has helped them have and given them the language that I really needed, that I wish I had had. People say you write the book that like you live through the stories and you write the book that you wish, existed. And it's true. Like this is the book that I remember feeling so lonely, having to go in and day out into a job that didn't feel like the work itself was great. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot, but going in and day out and feeling, wow, I'm truly invisible and hyper visible at the same time.
Mm.
And then even as an entrepreneur, even till recently, sometimes having moments where I'd just be like, did they just not hear me? Did they not see me? Did I say something that was so absurd? And so these are the moments that I live for. These are the moments that I wrote the book for, honestly.
I remember when you wrote about the condition of being both hyper visible and invisible at the same time. And it reminds me of another thing that I've been really sitting with and listening to and thinking about, which is something that Resmaa Menakem speaks to, which is the
Mm,
condition of having so much urgency while also having the experience of so much stuckness at the same time. It's like
mm,
two opposing factors that result in this just in
yeah.
whatever it is that we're feeling. And so there's one of the extra dog-eared pages in your book for me was when it was from page 26. And it kind of like said it all for me, your framing, which was really, you said, my focus is always on understanding and dismantling systems of oppression rather than being
That's right.
individuals. The problem isn't men, it's patriarchy. The problem isn't white people, it's white supremacy. The problem isn't straight people, it's homophobia. Recognize systems of oppression before letting individual defensiveness stop you from dismantling them. That says it all. And I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the systems that are in operation and what needs to be done to make them more inclusive for women of color who really want to find success as executives, as thought leaders, and experts in
Mm,
their field.
yeah. I have to say the reason I came up with this framing and why I truly deeply believe in it is because largely I've been lucky. I've certainly met toxic people and people who have willfully tried to do harm now and then. But largely, almost every single person I've met, whether it's an executive, whether it's a manager, whether it's a team leader, whether it's an employee, and I'm now speaking specifically to the workplace, largely I've seen people really want to do the right thing. They don't want to hurt other people. They don't want to be the cause of someone's distress in the workplace. And yet, left to chance and left to really the for us to continue status quo, which is built on these very discriminatory systems, many people just don't do the right thing, right? And many people aren't inclusive on purpose. And that's really why the title of the book and what I'm excited about is the book's title actually remained the same from the moment I conceptualized it till the moment of publication, which is generally not the case. Most authors, their titles change, but I think this was very clear. This is what it is. Like you have to practice inclusion on purpose. And so indeed, we are dealing with systems of also exacerbated by capitalism and greedy capitalism, right? This type of capitalism, which is very exploitative, which turns a blind eye to whether it's the state of the climate today, or whether we are looking at literally how are workers living and treating the state, poverty and hunger and exploitation of different countries. So there's definitely the exacerbation. Capitalism and hypercapitalism certainly exacerbates all of that. But really, at its core, systems of oppression are rooted in separating people out by what I really call arbitrary markers of difference. Yeah, I love the work of Angela Saini. I interviewed her for the book. I loved her books, Superior and Inferior. And Inferior looks at the science of are women and men. And again, looking at gender as a binary, although she's much more inclusive in her book. But even if you look at the science of sort of gender as a binary, men and women, are we very different? Are we so different? Are we so biologically different that that's the reason why men succeed in the workplace and women don't? And of course, the science says, nope, there's actually very little difference, even down to the biology. The differences are so minimal. And then her next book, Superior, about race science and frightening return of race science, same thing. People of color and white people, again, a very arbitrary difference when you bring it down to the genetic level. And in fact, what her and I talked about is there's often more genetic variance in the same, quote, type of people. Like, for example, I'm South Asian, you can be South Asian, and there's often more variance genetically between you and I than there would be between I and, for example, someone who presents as white or presents as Black. So again, these arbitrary markers of difference have been completely overemphasized to create differences in society. So I would say really today, the two biggest systems of oppression that exacerbate and compound with each other are racism and sexism. And that's why the book really focuses on intersectionality and the experiences of women of color in the workplace. So I think for one of the reasons why I wrote this book is because I want women of color to know it's not in your head. Don't gaslight yourself, and certainly don't let other people gaslight you into believing that it's all in your head, that, you are being treated the same as someone else when your instinct and when your gut and when truly an objective outsider who understands intersectionality, who's schooled in what bias, discrimination, racism, intersectionality looks like, can sit down and say to you, like, no, objectively, you are being treated differently. And that knowledge is really powerful, because what most of us really need to do first is get really clear and comfortable in our own hearts and in our own minds that this is what I'm facing, right? And then from there, take action. Do you bring it up to your manager? Do you talk to HR? Most of the time, the answer is no, do not talk to HR. Unfortunately, it can be very detrimental, especially as a woman of color. If you remember reading Ijioma's fantastic foreword for
Mhm.
inclusion on purpose, really don't go to HR. And then, or Is it you stepping out of that workplace, that industry, maybe out of a corporation and corporate life altogether, right? Maybe changing trajectory, maybe becoming an entrepreneur. And so I really wanted this book. I really want for women of color who are ambitious to know you don't have to contort yourself to such an extent that you become unrecognizable. I have been there, and it's important to get so comfortable in your own self that when you're facing these issues, you are able to name them. You're able to really say, this is what I'm facing, and then get comfortable with saying, I want something new for my life, right? I want to create the type of life that gives me joy and purpose and meaning. Because without all of us feeling that way, that our lives give us joy, our work lives give us joy and meaning and purpose, we're not going to be able to activate that for other people and other women of color specifically.
That's exactly right. And I have been there too. And one of the things that really stood out for me in the second, not second edition, but like the part 2 of yours and Jodi Ann Burey's article, Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome, was a statistic that was listed about the number of women of color who are starting businesses. And the number, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it was huge number. Do you remember that number?
I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but I will say that for a number of years, the fastest growing demographic who are starting businesses in America are women of color. And this is not new information. What is new information, or what I think is finally getting talked about a little more, is unfortunately a lot of these women of color owned businesses, women owned and women of color specifically owned businesses, often hit very, very low revenue goals. I think the number is the majority of them make less than $50,000 a year. So that's very little to run a business, honestly. And then on top of that, the majority of us, of women of color owned businesses, don't get growth capital when we most need it. So growth capital is not venture capital, right? It's not like the top end of, can your company make millions and millions and grow exponentially in that way, but rather, do you have the support you need to hire your first employee, or to invest in setting up a website, or to like literally pay for a business license? And these are the things that unfortunately women of color really, really struggle with. So the statistic of who's starting businesses, very high. Women of color really excited by this information. But I think a conversation that we aren't having enough is, how do we support these women of color entrepreneurs as they clearly create jobs and build into the economy?
Absolutely. Everything you just said is so spot on and so right on. And to bring it back to some of the pieces around really identifying systemic oppression as for what it is, I'm wondering if we can try something together, because Ruchika, my swim lane is really activating and sparking brave thought leadership with women and women of color who tend to be, like you said, overlooked, underestimated, yet they have the lived experience, the passion, the expertise, they have everything that they need. And so one of the foundational things I do with people, with my clients, is after establishing kind of their vision and mission, is identifying some of the protective responses to systemic oppression, right? That maybe serve as a barrier for fully embodying that vision. So would you be open to with me sharing some of these common barriers and maybe,
Yes,
and I love your beautiful brain on helping us understand how they really are more framing it from a systemic lens versus a personal thing.
Yes.
Okay. So one of the ones that I hear all the time is that getting public praise or being in the spotlight is really, really uncomfortable, even if I know I'm doing it for a higher purpose. I would rather put my head down and just hope that my work speaks for itself.
I'm like that. So
me too.
I really struggle. And this is probably, talking about myself, talking about the book, is right up there with some of the things I enjoy doing the least in the world, but understand the necessity of being found and creating community. Yeah. And I think being in systems that tell us that our voice doesn't matter, for me, it's compounded, right? Because I grew up in a very traditional, conservative, with a small C household in Singapore as part of the Indian diaspora, where specifically women in my community did not work outside the home. First from my ancestors to female ancestors to hold paid work outside my house. And so for me, part of it is that, and then compounded by certainly going through school as a racial minority and then going through college in the UK as a racial minority, and then obviously coming here to the United States and still being underrepresented. So I think for a lot of us women of color, just not seeing role models like us, not seeing our voices, like constantly being told like our voices don't matter and there's no room for you here, then having to suddenly, for those of us who get a little bit of prominence, and I speak for myself here, there's a real cognitive dissonance because for the last few decades, you've been told like, actually, your voice doesn't matter, don't speak up, all of those things. And then suddenly you're asked for your opinion, or you're asked for your thought leadership, or you're asked to bring your voice out into the world. And I think that's overcoming that barrier is very, very hard emotionally and mentally. And what helps me through it really is not only, yes, my voice matters, etc., but really the opportunity to find and connect with community, to really find people who hear me, who see me. There's nothing better than it.
There's nothing better than that. And there's nothing stronger than that because because again, it's about being able to recreate a world that maybe doesn't quite yet exist out in the open, but we can create our own like little mini versions of that. And as we do that, it ripples out and changes the world. That's such a good answer. That actually really helps me a lot. So thank you for that. Hey, if anything you're hearing today inspires you to get more visible as a go-to trusted voice for your audience and drive change towards your deeper mission, I've got something for you. LinkedIn is my favorite place to share my stories and build relationships with my co-conspirators and brand new friends. So I put together a free resource with 14 prompts to create your next post on LinkedIn. Take all the guesswork out of what to say and just start building your impact and influence. Be sure to tag me in your post so I can come by, cheer you on, and amplify your message. You can find those free prompts in the show notes. Okay, back to the episode.
I just want to say, like, I have the immense privilege of now hearing from, and sometimes when I get invited to speak, like I've spoken to women who work for NASA. I've spoken to various groups at very well-known organizations, some hospitals and doctors and healthcare workers at this time in a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. And so many of them talk about how hearing someone on the radio or seeing someone like them with their skin color or their life experiences lead in one way, shape, or form, or hearing their voices speak up on a matter really changed the course and the trajectory of their lives and inspired them to make change. So as much as it seems like, oh no, does it really matter so much? Or should I be the one speaking up? The answer is yes, absolutely. Because imagine there are people out there, I can speak for myself. I didn't see journalists who looked like me. I did not see people in tech who really had my background and my experience. And I certainly did not know many entrepreneurs doing the type of consulting and leadership development work that I had aspired to do, communicating about the issues of DEI. And I remember when I set up Candor, the majority of the responses I got were, no, but why do you need to set up a communications consultancy on diversity, equity, and inclusion? Like, we don't need help with branding around that. Now they do, and now it's too late. But back in the day when I set it up, people are like, I don't understand what you're trying to do here. Are you like an HR consultancy? And I was like, absolutely not. So I just think us living our best lives, being more authentic, as hard as it is, knowing that again, we're connecting with community. That's what this work is about.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, oh, that's so good. I just have to pause on that for a second and just really let that sink in. I love that. There's a beautiful line by June Jordan, which then Alice Walker turned into a book of poems, which is very much, we are the ones we've been waiting for, right? Yes. Barack Obama used that in some of his speeches, and that says it all to me. If we don't see ourselves reflected back, sometimes it's up to us to take that torch and become that for the next generation that's coming up behind us.
Yeah. And speaking of quotes, Dr. Maya Angelou said, your crown has been paid for, put it on your head and wear it. And I think for more of us who have been underestimated and overlooked. It is a reminder that we actually were always there and that there is an absolute, I don't even know what to say. The foundation has been laid. And yes, maybe their stories didn't come out in the media. Maybe we never heard their names. A lot of women, and especially women of color, have been rendered invisible by history. But they were there and they were fighting for us and they were creating the pathway. So more of us need to remember the crown has been paid for. Put it on your head. Make everyone before you proud and create those paths for the ones coming ahead, behind you, rather.
So good. So good. Oh, okay. I want to ask you one more of these types of questions where it's one of those barriers, mental barriers that comes up often, which feels often like a personal thing, but it's actually a systemic response.
Yes.
So I have a whole list here, but I'm just going to ask you one more because this is
I'll
one I
try and
hear
be
often.
succinct, because if you want to
Oh
do more,
no.
like I know
Well,
I'm like going
I
off
could just
on a
listen.
tangent.
I could just listen to you talk all day. So I don't want you to be
Thank
succinct
you.
because so many gems just fall out of your mouth as you share.
Mm.
But what about this one? I've spoken at length about this one with my friend Dr. Niro Bakshi, who's a board certified
Yes.
psychiatrist. Yes, yes, yes.
Yes.
And
It's amazing. Yes.
she is amazing. And one of the things we've talked about is this feeling like, gosh, if we take a stand for something, it might feel like we're speaking for or on behalf of a group of people. If I say this,
Mm.
I'm speaking on behalf of all South Asian people. I know white
Mm.
people don't think that, or all straight people don't think that. You know what I'm saying? So how do we look at that from a more systemic lens?
Mm. Mm. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said that the danger of a single story and the danger of stereotypes is not that they are necessarily wrong, but that they are incomplete. And I
Mm,
think when I think about amazing TED Talk, one that I feel should be required watching, I absolutely assign it to every single class I teach. But
mm,
the danger of a single story is this, that unfortunately, so many of our stories have been, again, overlooked. And on top of that, when they are told, they have been told not by us, for us. They have been told to placate the white gaze and for white people to feel more comfortable. There are a ton of stereotypes that are running around. And so many of us have been flattened into flat characters, essentially, people who speak for your entire population. Whereas, as we know, for people in the dominant majority, there are many ways, right? Like I talk about this in leadership all the time. I talk about this when I talk about leaders. For male leaders, you can be an Elon Musk, you can be a Steve Jobs, you can be a Satya Nadella, you can be a Jeff Bezos, you can be a Bill Gates. All of these quote unquote leaders have very different styles and they're all acceptable. Whereas for women leaders, and here we really talk about white women are the ones who are majority in corporations, are the majority of who's being represented, there is a very narrow definition of how you need to show up, what you need to wear, how you need to speak. They have to go through a ton of coaching, executive presence, and all these coded words and concepts. And so what starts to happen again is not seeing yourself represented. It really takes a toll on all of us, right? And that concern and that fear of having to be perfect, right? Because we're representing every single person.
mm,
What a burden. How
mm,
exhausting. And I think it's very important for us to A, let that go, and
mm,
B, if you need to, then qualify it. I always add this caveat. People will say, oh, but culturally, like you come from a culture where women don't have a lot of rights. And I'll actually say, absolutely not. We had
mm,
my ancestors are from India, where we had a female prime minister back in the 1960s. Can't say the same for the United States, for example.
mm,
At the same time, I do caveat. I say there are stereotypes about the docile and the submissive South Asian Indian woman that unfortunately I certainly grew up with, and I certainly grew up internalizing and having to navigate and fight against for most of my life. And I add the caveat, India is a country and diaspora, it makes up more than 1.1 billion people in the world. So you are going to see very many different types of ways of being, right? And that nuance is super important. There is nuance and complexity to this. So for me, I think for all of us navigating this, that fear is real. It's valid. It's unfortunate because of the reality of not having enough of our stories told. And hopefully, as more of our stories come to light, we'll feel less of that pressure. And it's okay if you feel that pressure to name it and also frame that caveat, right? This is my story. This is what I have observed. And it's different. And I don't speak for everyone who has the same skin color as me or comes from the same identities.
Yeah. Yeah. And something that we were talking about earlier before I think we started the recording was that well, first of all, I love how you have really positioned this work as a practice, this work of inclusion as a practice, as a daily practice. My kind of roots, my professional roots were in addiction recovery, and being able to manage this one day at a time for the rest of our lives is actually the way forward. It's not something that's going to quickly change. I think inclusion is a practice. So I'm just curious if you have any, and I'm sure you have a lot of insight because your book is very much about this, but how do we take the gems that you just shared and really start to turn that into a habit for ourselves
Mm.
instead of,
Mm.
do you know what I mean? How do we make that an ongoing
Mm.
practice?
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about addiction. So one of the challenges I've struggled with, my response when things get hard and born out of traumas I faced in my childhood is overeating and
Mm,
really not being able to have a healthy relationship with food. In fact, it took me decades to be able to get to any semblance of being able to name, like, this is what's happening. This is why I'm not being able to like control and look at my food in a healthy manner. And then the pandemic happened. And certainly during the pandemic, it was clear like what was happening. And I lost all semblance of like control of this is or even just being able to be mindful about what's going on. And it took me until early 2022 to really get back to that level of like mindfulness, of looking at a healthy relationship with food. Speaking of addiction, I mean, it truly, what I realized and what I learned in my journey to get back into having a healthy relationship with food and not turning to it immediately as a trauma response
mm,
was realizing how much of it is in that daily practice and almost as we said before the recorder started, an hourly, sometimes by the minute practice, right? And so what I mean is, and I'm using food as an example because hopefully this is something that will resonate with everyone and then we can extrapolate it into inclusion. But really, there were times where I'd be like, okay, I'm going to be really mindful about what I'm eating. And then I would go off that track of what I wanted to eat and what I knew would be healthy and nourishing for my body. And then I would say, well, I lost the plot there, so I might as well keep on going. And
mm,
then you go into a downward spiral of, oh, this is just not going to happen for me. So I might as well not even try. I'm just going to give up. And I think sometimes what happens with inclusion is I see people doing that too. Like people will say, especially people in the dominant group will say, I tried, but then I got called out for this. Or I realized like I made a mistake. So now I don't want to engage in this work anymore. And it turns into a downward spiral. And I think what all of us have an opportunity to do is, again, sometimes in a minute by minute practice, first, obviously, develop the intentionality and the awareness of what's missing, whose voices are missing, what are the experiences of people who have largely been underrepresented in terms of demographics and numbers and overlooked and underestimated because of those identities. What are their experiences in the workplace? What are the biggest barriers they face? And then again, both in a minute by minute and hour by hour approach, as well as a longer term holistic approach, understanding what are those practices you can develop to be more inclusive? What does it look like to amplify someone's voice who generally doesn't get the platform or whose voice is overlooked or silenced? I see this all the time in meetings when I see people being inclusive and practicing inclusion on purpose. What I'll notice is they'll go out of the way to say things like, well, to amplify Ruchika's point or
mm,
to make this person's point, to even add to this brilliant thing that this person said, these are the ways that we can practice inclusion without it having to turn into this big effort, without it having to turn into something that you get an award for. It really is your daily way of being. And my hope is once you see it, you can't unsee it.
That's so brilliant. And I want to just add to that just for a slight bit, which is that you mentioned, for example, if we get called out, it becomes we lose the practice. But just like with addiction or any kind of long-term chronic illness, there are going to be relapses, there are going to be reoccurrences of disease. And so that doesn't necessarily mean, like you said, we have to throw out the whole thing. We just get back on the wagon, essentially. We get back on the
Mm-hmm.
train the
Mm-hmm.
next day and continue. It's this is going to be
Mm-hmm.
part of the process. So I love how you frame that. That's so good.
And often the biggest growth happens in those moments, right? Like the
Mm,
biggest growth for me, even now, and I make mistakes too. I'm not, part of this work is nobody is born with the ability to be inclusive all the time. In fact, we're
mm,
hardwired, as I wrote in the book, we're really hardwired to look for similarities. Now, the thing is, before we were socialized to see race and see gender and all of these other forms of discrimination and separation, in the past, the way we were hardwired was to look for other humans and keep animals in our hunter gatherer days, keep animals at bay, right? Keep other
yeah.
animals at bay and look for people like us. Now, that has obviously evolved in the time that we live in to now look for people with our identities. Oh, you're the same gender as me. Let me give you a job on my team. Oh, you're the same race as me. I want to think about promoting you. Again, how much of this is unconscious? I think there's some debate in the DEI community about that. And I err on the side of, well, it's certainly my perspective is I think a lot of it that does exist is conscious, right? Or at least it may not be deliberate, but it's conscious. So another conversation for another day. But yeah, indeed, like the reality is none of us actually have been hardwired to be inclusive to other people.
Mm,
Right? So it does take that additional awareness. It does take that intention and effort to say, instead of hiring the first person who I recognize, like I recognize their name is familiar to me, and oh, they went to the same college as me, let me hire them. It does mean stepping out of those go-to strategies of like, let's just hire someone who looks like me or who I feel comfortable with, and saying, no, I'm going to go the additional mile because I know I will have a better outcome as a result of it.
right. And then slowly but surely a new habit is formed and
Absolutely.
the world starts to change.
Yes.
Ruchika, I could talk to you forever and ever and ever and ever, but I know you're busy. And so I want to ask you the last question that I love to ask this to everyone that comes on the show, which is really, what is your big dreamy vision for the future?
I think my big dreamy vision is it would be amazing if no woman of color ever goes through life questioning, girl of color and later woman of color goes through life questioning, do I belong? Am I good
Mm,
enough? Will my voice be heard? And really being able to take up space in a way that often I see my dominant group, even students, and certainly later on in the work I do in organizations and in society, a lot of dominant group people I meet, it's clear like they're very comfortable taking up space. Whereas I think for a lot of us women of color, we've been socialized, we've experienced so much of pushback for taking up space. We've been rewarded for being quiet and for being seen, not heard, or sometimes not even seen. And so my dream is that we all truly take up space and feel like there is a reason why we're here and we completely belong. So I feel like there's that. And then the other sort of big dreamy vision is that nobody ever questions that, are these experiences real? Give me more data. And could you give me more data? Could you give me more examples? It would be great to get to a space where there isn't pushback on this because this is real. It exists. There's research, there's data. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are good for businesses. They're good for people. It's good for productivity, for innovation, like all of that. And now I think we're really beyond that. So if nobody asks me, give me the business case for why we should do this work, I will be thrilled.
Oh, I'm so with you, my friend. Well, you know what's great about that is your work, both yours and Jodianne's two articles and your book are huge tools in that toolkit, or rather toys in the toy box to create that world. That your pieces, your work are instrumental to that world being a reality. So I just want to really name that and honor you for that. Now, where can people find you? How can they connect with you, stay in touch with you? Where are you on these internet streets?
Thank you so much for saying that. Before I tell you that, I have to say I also highly recommend as a resource Jodi Ann's TED Talk on the myth of authenticity. She is just I remember watching and just being completely blown away. And this is before our HBR articles came about. And so to transition into sort of where you can find me, my website is inclusiononpurpose.co. That redirects to my personal website. I am very active, perhaps too active on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And for all of them, you can just look me up by my first initial and last name. So RTULSHYAN. And yeah, beyond that, like I love hearing from people, even critical feedback, very open to it, but really, really love hearing from people. If you've read the articles, if you've read my book, if you have other things to say about other things that I've done, very open to hearing from you.
Well, we will link to all of that in the show notes, and as well as Jodi Ann's brilliant TED Talk as well. I just can't say thank you enough, not just for your time here, but for putting a ladder into the pool that so many of us were swimming in around imposter syndrome, perfectionism, overwork, all these things, and helping us realize that we've been swimming in this water and that there's a way out, right? There's a way out. It's so funny because when you finally see it, it's like you can't unsee it, but so many of us have been swimming in there for so long. So I really, really thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And a reminder, I love being in community with you. I'm so glad we're connected. Yes, on the internet. I hope in person very soon, but also that our collective liberation only can happen if we collectively and in our own ways collectively work towards this better future where we all have an opportunity to shine and to speak and to be heard. And so I'm very grateful for this platform. I'm really grateful that we get to be in community together and do this work together.
Me too, because we are interdependent. That is for sure. And that's something we've got to remember. We've got to remember that.
Yes. And that's actually something that these systems have us not wanting to believe, right? Like part of the strategy was, I studied colonialism. Part of the strategy that many of the colonialists had when they went to conquer and to extract and exploit from other countries and other societies was divide and conquer.
That's right.
So I see that. I don't use the terms divide and conquer for that reason, because I saw what I saw in my ancestral land of India. I saw the partition of India and Pakistan and all of that. But the reality is that we are taught, like we live in these separate worlds. We live in these silos, don't support each other. Her liberation is not my liberation, when actually it's all of us together. And I really hope we can continue to build coalition and solidarity, especially in groups of women of color, right? Our struggles may be different and our experiences may be different, but we are heading towards a common goal and we have to do it together.
That's right. That's exactly it. Thank you so much for closing us on that beautiful thought. I'm going to hold this in my heart, and I can't wait till we get to see each other soon. Okay, so you've heard from us. Now I want to hear from you. Leaving a review helps us so much in growing our reach and supporting more folks with this podcast. And even better, I would love for you to send me a note on LinkedIn with your takeaways from this episode. I cherish and respond to every message, so I can't wait to hear from you. And if you want to go even deeper, check out the show notes to take your next step.